Chapter 15. Graduation. After my abortion, I wrote to Tate and said I didn't want to come back to Suffolk. I enrolled in Girls Commercial High School on Bergen Street in 1936. It was just down the street from Boube's, but the schoolwork was hard and I struggled my entire junior year, sleeping on Boube's couch and wrestling with algebra every night. Girls High was way ahead of Suffolk High, and I never would have graduated on time. So after the school year ended, I returned to Virginia to finish high school. When I came back to Suffolk, the first thing I said to Peter was, "We can't see each other anymore. Don't come by." He said, "I've been waiting for you. I still love you." And I was swayed, because I still felt a deep love for him. Not long after that, I was in the store, behind the counter, and two young black women came in. I overheard them talking about Peter, and one of them says, "Oh yeah, he's getting married soon." I almost fell over. Tate was standing right next to me, so I grabbed a rag and started wiping the counter, edging close to them, eavesdropping. I was practically falling over the counter trying to hear them. "Oh yeah," says the other, "he got such and such pregnant." She named a black girl who lived behind us in the neighborhood. I went right out and found him. The heck with who knew about us then. I was so mad I marched right down the road to his house in daylight and got him out. "Tell me the truth," I said. He confessed it. "They're making me marry her," he said. "My folks are making me." "Did you get her pregnant?" "Yeah." Ugh, that messed me up. I told him I didn't want to see him anymore and walked back through the black neighborhood into the store and went upstairs and cried my heart out because I still loved him. I went through this entire ordeal and here he was getting busy with somebody else. The fact that he was black and the girl he was marrying was black, well, that hurt me even more. If the world were fair, I suppose I would have married him, but there was no way that could happen in Virginia, not in 1937. I made up my mind then that I was going to leave Suffolk for good. I was 17, in my last year of high school, and for the first time in my life, I was starting to have opinions of my own. There was no life for me there. I was planning to leave for New York, but see, I had Mame. She was my eyes and ears in America. She couldn't speak English, and I translated for her and looked out for her because Tate didn't care for Mame at all. Her stomach was starting to bother her, and she was starting to have these fainting spells, She'd just black out in the middle of the day. Tate couldn't have cared less. He hired a black woman to look after Mame, and that woman cared for Mame more than he did. She'd stay late and look after Mame, even if he didn't pay her, and he paid her so little as it was. He thought money he spent to take care of his wife would do it, substitute for the fact that he didn't love her. But a wife wants love. She was a good Jewish wife to him, but their marriage was starting to crumble because he didn't care about her. That's why I knew I was leaving home. I wasn't going to have an arranged marriage like my parents did. I'd rather die first, which I did do in a way, because I lost my mother and sister when I left home. Well, the kids in my high school were excited and giggling about the prom and graduation and making plans, but I'd been to New York and seen the big time and didn't plan on going to either. No one asked me to the prom anyway, but Francis kept saying, "Please go to graduation, Ruth. We'll walk together on graduation day." I never told Francis about any of that business I was going through. None of that stuff about Peter and my abortion in New York. She knew my home life wasn't perfect, but Frances wasn't the type to question you. She was just a giving, kind person. So I decided to go to the graduation ceremony for Frances, because Frances was my best friend and I would do anything for her. Suffolk High had this graduation ceremony where the seniors lined up in their caps and gowns outside the high school and marched onto Main Street double file to the Protestant church for a ceremony. They called it a pre-graduation or a baccalaureate or some such thing. I had to ask Tate for money for the cap and down, and the minute he heard about me marching into a Gentile church, he said, "No, forget it. You're not marching into any Gentile church." He was dead set against it. My parents were so old-fashioned European in their ways, it wasn't funny. Like if you took a social worker into my house and he talked to my parents, it would be like talking to that wall over there. They were stuck in their ways. There was no way they could change. He was still my father, and I was still a teenager living in his house, and he could still pull off his belt and beat the mess out of me when he wanted. So what could I do? He wasn't worried about my graduation. What bothered him more was that I had no marriage prospects, and he began to take me on his business jaunts to Portsmouth and Norfolk, around the stores and wholesale supply houses, and he'd introduce me to the merchants and their sons if they had any. It was like he was saying, "Here's my daughter on display. What do you think?" Sometimes he'd send me on jaunts by myself, driving the car and pulling the trailer, me and Dee Dee. We'd load up the trailer full of goods from the warehouses and drive through the dismal swamp around Portsmouth and Norfolk. Folks would tell us, "Watch out for the red light district in Norfolk," and we'd go around Norfolk avoiding red traffic lights. Well, I was upset with Tate about graduation, and we weren't speaking for a while, but he'd reached a point where he really needed me to help him run the store because Sam was gone and Mame wasn't feeling well. Her stomach was starting to really bother her, to the point where she'd be doubled over in pain. We'd take her to the town doctor, and he'd say this or that. He mentioned an operation of some sort, but he didn't know. He was a nasty old man. I went to him once, and he was as nasty as he could be, touching me in places that were not necessary and saying obscene things, so I never went back to him. Of course, I couldn't tell anybody about it. But he looked at Mame and said he didn't know what was wrong with her. Well, Tate and I argued about the cap and gown for a long time, and at one point I got so mad I revealed my plans to go to New York after graduation. "I'm going back to New York. I'm leaving." He stalked out the room, cursing and swearing. A few minutes later, Mame followed him out and spoke to him. They were rarely speaking by then, and the next day he came over and gave me the money for my cap and gown and said, "You can participate in the march, but don't go into that church. It's forbidden." "I'm going to the ceremony," I said. "Respect your mother and me," he said. "Don't break the law of the Bible. Don't go into that Gentile church," he said. Well, my mind was made up. On graduation day, Dee Dee and I opened up the store, set out the meats, stacked the fresh vegetables, and I worked behind the counter until it was time to go. Of course, my parents wouldn't go to that Gentile graduation, so I put on my cap and gown and walked the 6 blocks to Suffolk High School alone and waited for Francis in the parking lot. Francis was late getting there, which gave the other students and their parents something to stare at, to watch me standing there by myself. I was ready to turn around and run home by the time she showed up. I told Francis, "I'm not sure I can go into that church." She said, "I understand, Ruth. I'll graduate by myself then, because I don't want to graduate next to anyone but you." Well, I felt like I couldn't let that happen, so I said, "I can do it. Let's go." We took a picture in our caps and gowns and got in line double file and marched together. The line marched out of Suffolk High School's yard and onto Main Street and slowed as it bottled up at the church doorway. As we approached the church doorway, I started to shake and sweat, and just before we reached the church doorway, I stepped out of line. I couldn't do it. I just couldn't go inside that church. In my heart, I was still a Jew. I had done some wrong things in my life, but I was still my parents' child. I turned away, but not before Frances saw my tears. She got out of line herself, but I waved her away. "Frances, you go on in. Don't miss the ceremony because of me." She went in. She had to wipe her own face from the tears, but she got back in line and marched through the ceremony alone, and she sat through the graduation ceremony next to my empty seat. I walked home sobbing in my cap and gown and caught a Greyhound bus for New York the very next day.